The records do not align. If you open a standard ledger of 19th century architectural history, you are greeted with a series of clean, linear successions. We are told that the great exhibitions of London, Paris, and Chicago were mere celebrations of industrial progress, temporary structures of lath and plaster designed to be burned or razed once the crowds dispersed. But look closer at the photographs. Examine the shadows. Ask yourself how a civilization allegedly travelling by horse and buggy managed to coordinate the precision-cut stone and massive load distribution required for the Court of Honour in 1893. They tell us these were ephemeral dreams. I see something else. I see a global infrastructure, a standardized language of power that existed before the maps were redrawn. It is not a coincidence. It is not an evolution. It is a residual. The year the world changed was not marked by a single battle, but by a systematic erasure of the Tartarian legacy, specifically their mastery over the world's original currency, atmospheric energy, and the intrinsic value of the earth itself. We are taught that money is a social construct backed by gold or decree. What if the original money was something far more literal? What if wealth was measured by the capacity to pull power from the very air we breathe? Observe the cathedrals of the old world. Notice the intricate metalwork atop the spires, the copper domes, and the strange, non-functional antennas that grace the rooftops of every major municipal building from San Francisco to St. Petersburg. Official history calls them ornaments. Art historians call them aesthetic flourishes. I call them components. Not decoration, not religious symbolism. Something else. When you analyze the physical properties of these structures, you find they function as massive capacitors. The Tartarian people did not trade in paper or coin, they traded in access. Their buildings were the banks, and the currency was the frequency. But the records have been scrubbed. The institutional gatekeeping of our modern academia has labelled this pseudoscience to ensure the tether remains unbroken. They want you to look at a palace and see a king's vanity. They don't want you to see a power plant. If the medium of exchange was once free and ubiquitous, the current system of debt-based survival becomes a prison. The destruction of this original money was the greatest heist in human history, and the evidence is hidden in plain sight, buried under the rubble of urban renewal and great fires that suspiciously targeted the very hubs of this ancient network. It began with a single anomaly in a dusty archive in Brussels. A map dated 1842 showed a city that, by all accounts, should not have existed with such complexity. The star forts of the 17th century were not defensive fortifications. Ask yourself why a military commander would build a fortress in the shape of a perfect fractal. Ballistics do not require sacred geometry. The angles of a star fort are designed for resonance, not for repelling cannon fire. These were nodes in a planetary grid. When the Tartarian influence was systematically dismantled, these nodes were the first to be renamed, repurposed, or filled with mud. The Great Mud Flood is often spoken of in hushed tones, dismissed as a fringe theory, but the physical evidence is undeniable. Go to any major city and look at the first floor windows. Why are they half buried in the earth? Why do the grandest entrances sit 5 feet below the modern sidewalk? They tell us it was for sewage or light wells. Not this, not that, something else. It was the physical manifestation of a global reset. The old world was drowned in silt to hide the foundations of the previous era's economy. To destroy a people's money, you must first destroy their history. The narrative of the Wild West is a fabrication. We are told of pioneers moving into an empty wilderness, building sod houses and struggling for survival. Yet, when they arrived in places like Salt Lake City or San Francisco, they found massive Greco-Roman edifices already standing. They found gas lighting systems and paved streets that predated the supposed arrival of civilization. The institutional erasure requires us to believe that these structures were built by the same people who were simultaneously fighting off starvation in log cabins. It is an intellectual insult. What if the pioneers weren't building? What if they were inheriting? What if they were the scavengers of a fallen giant? The Tartarian people were not a single ethnic group, but a global confederation linked by a shared understanding of the Earth's natural conductivity. Their destruction was necessary for the rise of the central banking system. If you can control the source of heat, light, and motion, you control the human soul. By dismantling the atmospheric energy collectors and replacing them with metered wires, the architects of the New World turned a global inheritance into a private commodity. Consider the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871. We are given the story of a cow and a lantern. A convenient tale for a catastrophic event, but look at the photographs of the aftermath. Stone buildings turned to dust, iron beams twisted like taffy. These are not the results of a simple timber fire. This was a targeted demolition of a Tartarian hub. The city was rebuilt with a new purpose, to house the institutions that would manage the new artificial economy. This pattern repeats. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. San Francisco, 1906. Whenever a node of the old world's energy grid became a threat to the emerging monopoly of the oil and coal barons, the city burned, not by accident, not by fate, by design. The erasure trope is a powerful tool in the hands of those who write the textbooks. By burning the physical evidence and rewriting the architectural blueprints, they severed our connection to the past. They forced us to look at the ruins and see new construction. They turned the magnificent into the mundane. Ask yourself why we can no longer build with such permanence. Why does our modern world feel so fragile, so temporary? It is because we are living in the leftovers of a superior age. The institutional gatekeepers will tell you that the Tartarian Empire is a myth born of mislabeled maps. They claim Tartary was merely a geographic catch-all for Central Asia. But why then do the old encyclopedias list it as a sovereign nation with its own flag, its own laws, and its own unique system of commerce? Why did the Russian Empire and the British Empire conspire to carve it up? The truth is that Tartary represented an alternative to the industrial colonial model. Their money was not based on the extraction of labour, but on the harmonisation with the environment. When you see a post office in a small American town that looks like a Roman temple, you are looking at a repurposed Tartarian relay station. The staccato rhythm of our modern life, the constant push for growth, the endless cycle of debt, is a direct result of the loss of this original system. We are vibrating at a frequency of scarcity because the abundance of the old world was stolen from us. Not just the gold, not just the land, the very air. What if the Great Depression was not an economic fluke, but the final calibration of the new control system? By that time, the Tartarian infrastructure had been almost entirely scrubbed from the public consciousness. The last of the world's fairs had been demolished. The children of the reset were now adults, raised on a curriculum of lies. They were taught that the world had always been difficult, that energy had always been expensive, and that the state was the sole provider of order. The somber reality of our current existence is that we are walking through a museum of a civilization we are no longer allowed to understand. Every time you pay a utility bill, you are paying a tax on a stolen heritage. Every time you see a historic building being torn down to make way for a glass box, you are witnessing the continuation of the erasure. It is a persistent, quiet violence, a slow motion destruction of the evidence that we were once something more. Investigating this history requires a certain level of intellectual provocation. You must be willing to look at a skyscraper and ask if its true purpose is hidden in the basement. You must be willing to read between the lines of the official censuses. In the late 1800s, there was a massive influx of foundlings and orphan trains. Thousands of children with no documented past were shipped across the country to populate the newly cleared cities. Ask yourself, where did these children come from? And more importantly, what happened to their parents? The revisionist documentary of our lives suggests that a plague or a war took them, but the pattern suggests a more chilling possibility. They were the casualties of the transition. The people who remembered the old money had to be removed so the new money could take root. The orphans were the blank slates upon which the new narrative was written. Not a tragedy, not a social program, a reboot. As I stand before the ruins of a once great station, I feel the weight of this forbidden knowledge. The air feels heavy with the static of what could have been. The load distribution of the arches above me is perfect, a testament to a physics we have forgotten. The institutional erasure is almost complete, but the stones still speak. They speak of a time when the world was connected by more than just trade routes and telegrams. They speak of a year when the Tartarian people, not as an ethnic group, but as a global collective, lost the battle for the Earth's energy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a forensic reconstruction of a crime scene. The victim is our collective memory. The weapon was a rewritten history. The motive was the total monopolization of human existence. What remains? A few grainy photographs, a few buildings that were too large to tear down, a few anomalies in the tax records, but mostly there is a feeling, a sense of displacement that haunts the modern psyche. We know, deep down, that this is not how it was supposed to be. We know that the original money was not a burden, but a gift. As you look out over the skyline of your own city, ask yourself, how much of what you see is a lie? What if the buildings are not buildings? What if the history is not history? And what if the year the world was destroyed was actually the year the current world was born? The loop remains open. The investigation continues. Not in the libraries, but in the streets. Not in the books, but in the bricks. We are the investigators now. We are the ones who must decide if the truth is worth the cost of the illusion. The transition was not merely physical, it was psychological. To truly dismantle a global network of energetic abundance, the architects of the new paradigm had to re-engineer the very concept of value. Ask yourself why the mid-19th century saw the sudden aggressive standardization of time. Before the railroads, before the massive synchronization of the clocks, every town lived by its own solar rhythm. Not this, not that, something else. The imposition of Greenwich Mean Time was the first digital fence. It chopped the continuous flow of Tartarian existence into metered intervals. Time became money because energy had been stolen. When the atmospheric collectors were decommissioned or hidden behind the facade of decorative masonry, the human being was forced to sell their hours to buy back the light that used to be free. The institutional gatekeeping of our modern era calls this modernization. I call it the initial phase of the Great Enclosure. The world's original money, the resonance of the earth, was replaced by a clock that never stops ticking against you. Examine the blueprints of the great asylums built between 1850 and 1890. These were not hospitals. Look at the floor plans. Massive, sprawling wings, high ceilings, and those same ubiquitous copper domes. They were often located on the outskirts of cities, built over the same ley lines as the star forts. History tells us they were built to house the insane. But who were the insane? Perhaps they were the ones who refused to forget. Perhaps they were the last remnants of the Tartarian citizenry who still knew how to tune into the frequency. By labelling the dissenters as mad, the new authorities could legally disappear an entire generation of witnesses. The asylums were the processing centres for the erasure. Not healing, not housing, something else. They were the prisons for the memory of the old world. When you walk past an abandoned state hospital today, you are not looking at a ruin of social failure. You are looking at a decommissioned server of the human soul. The architecture of the Industrial Revolution is a study in brutal contrast. On one hand, you have the soaring, ethereal stone of the inherited world. On the other, the soot-stained brick and iron of the coal-fired era. Why would a civilization capable of building the translucent glass palaces of the 1851 Great Exhibition choose to live in the squalor of tenements? It is an evolutionary regression that defies logic, unless, of course, the regression was forced. The Tartarian mastery of load distribution and seismic resonance suggests a deep understanding of the Earth as a living battery. The coal-fired factories were not a step forward, they were a tether. By forcing the population into smoke-filled valleys, the controllers broke the connection to the clean atmospheric ether. They replaced the invisible currency of the air with the heavy, dirty currency of the mine. This was the year the world's original money was burned, not for warmth, not for power, for control. Ask yourself why the history of the Great Tartary was removed from British and Russian maps simultaneously in the late 1800s. A nation that once spanned from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean does not simply vanish. It is liquidated. The institutional erasure required a global consensus. The Crimean War was not a dispute over territory. It was a clean-up operation. It was the coordinated effort of the rising empires to eliminate the last operational hubs of the Tartarian energy grid. The charge of the Light Brigade was a suicide mission into the heart of a technology they didn't want the public to understand. When the smoke cleared, the maps were reprinted. The boundaries were redrawn. Tartary became Siberia, or Central Asia. A vibrant, technologically advanced confederation was reduced to a wasteland of nomadic tribes in the minds of the next generation. The erasure trope is most effective when it is absolute. The technical language of the new world was designed to obscure the old. We speak of current, banks, and liquidity. These are not metaphors. They are the linguistic leftovers of a hydro-resonant energy system. The Tartarian people understood that water is a conductor, a memory carrier, and a source of life. Their cities were built on intricate canal systems that served as the circuitry of the urban battery. When the reset occurred, these canals were filled with the debris of the old buildings, the mud flood, and paved over. We now drive our cars over the buried veins of a dead giant. The liquidity of our modern banks is a hollow mockery of the actual liquid power that once flowed beneath our feet. We are trading paper symbols for a ghost of a reality, not wealth, not prosperity. Something else, a simulation of value designed to keep us digging in the dirt. Consider the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. They called it a celebration of a century of independence, but look at the machinery hall. It housed the Corliss steam engine, a behemoth that supposedly powered the entire fair. Yet the lighting of the fairgrounds was achieved through methods that even the engineers of the time struggled to explain. The Corliss engine was a prop, a massive iron distraction designed to convince the public that power came from pistons and coal, while the buildings themselves were still drawing from the ether. The World's Fairs were the ultimate psychological operations. They showed the public the wonders of the future while simultaneously dismantling the wonders of the past. Once the gates closed, the buildings were dynamited. The evidence was pulverized. The White City became a black memory. Why destroy such beauty? Because beauty with a purpose is dangerous. A building that provides free energy cannot be allowed to stand in a world built on debt. The staccato rhythm of the demolition hammers has been the soundtrack of the last century. From the destruction of New York's original Pennsylvania station to the modernization of European capitals, the goal has remained the same, the removal of the evidence. They tell us it is about efficiency and progress. But ask yourself why the new buildings are so fragile. Why do they crumble after 50 years while the Tartarian stone endures for centuries? It is because the new architecture is designed to be temporary. It is designed to be unmemorable. A people with no permanent monuments have no sense of their own permanence. We are being kept in a state of perpetual newness, a frantic race toward a future that never arrives, while the foundations of our true history are systematically ground into gravel. This is the institutional erasure of the physical plane. What if the gold standard was the first major diversion? By convincing the world that value was tied to a rare yellow metal, the controllers diverted our attention from the true source of abundance. Gold is a conductor, yes, but its true value in the Tartarian age was its role in the energy grid, not its weight in a vault. By hoarding the gold, they didn't just hoard wealth, they stripped the components from the machine. They took the spark plugs out of the engine and told us the metal was money. We have been staring at the shiny pieces of a broken generator for 150 years, believing we are rich if we have enough of them. The somber truth is that a bar of gold is useless in a world that has forgotten how to use it to draw power from the stars. We are like children playing with the gears of a clock we can no longer wind. The pattern is global. From the pyramids of Giza to the cathedrals of South America, the signature of the Tartarian architects is the same load distribution, the same acoustic perfection, the same alignment with the celestial bodies. This was a unified civilization, a world before nations as we understand them. The year they destroyed the world's original money was the year they gave us patriotism. They divided the unified grid into competing territories. They told us that the people on the other side of the river were our enemies, so that we would not notice that both sides of the river were being robbed. The Great War was not a conflict of ideologies. It was the final harvesting of the Tartarian remnants. It was the grinding down of the last star forts into the mud of the trenches. It was the ultimate ritual of erasure. We are left with the silence, the suspicious, heavy silence that hangs over the official records of the 19th century. We are left with the strange architectural choices of our ancestors. We are left with a feeling of being guests in a house we once owned. The investigation is intellectually provocative because it requires us to admit we have been colonized by our own leaders. The somber reality is that the money we use today is the chain that binds us to the wreckage of the old world. But once you see the pattern, You cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the copper domes for what they are, the illusion begins to crack. The fair unresolved philosophical open loop remains. If the world's original money was free, what does that make us? And if we can find the frequency again, what happens to the ones who hid it? The inquiry does not end here. It begins every time you look up at a spire and ask, what if? The silence of the archives is not an absence of information. It is a presence of intent. When you step into the vaulted halls of a national library, you are walking through a curated cemetery. The institutional gatekeepers have meticulously pruned the family tree of human achievement until only the branches they grafted remain. Ask yourself why the patent offices of the late 19th century were suddenly flooded with innovations that seemed to spring from a vacuum. Not this, not that. Something else. The vacuum was actually a reservoir. The inventors of the Gilded Age, the Edisons, the J.P. Morgans, the Marconis, were not pioneers. They were the liquidators of the Tartarian estate. They took the integrated wireless and resonant technologies of the previous era and broke them into patentable, sellable, and taxable fragments. This was the year the world's original money, the universal frequency, was privatized. They didn't invent the light bulb, they invented the meter. Consider the layout of Washington, D.C. or Paris. The city planners tell us these designs were inspired by Enlightenment ideals and aesthetic symmetry. But look at the load distribution of the energetic flow. The wide boulevards are not for parades. They are for the transmission of waves. The obelisks are not monuments to dead men. They are grounding rods. In the Tartarian system, the city was a living circuit board, and the inhabitants were the beneficiaries of its constant low-frequency hum. This hum kept the human nervous system in a state of equilibrium. When the reset occurred, the frequency was shifted. The city was repurposed into a broadcast tower for anxiety. By disrupting the natural resonance of the urban grid, the new masters created a psychological dependency on the very systems that were draining us. The somber truth is that the noise of modern life is a tactical jamming signal. It prevents us from hearing the original money still vibrating in the stone. The disappearance of the Tartarian people was facilitated by a linguistic coup, not just the renaming of cities, but the redefining of the word civilization itself. We were taught that civilization began with the accumulation of surplus and the hierarchy of the state, but the star forts tell a different story. They tell of a civilization based on the distribution of energy and the hierarchy of resonance. The erasure trope works by making the superior look primitive. They took the grand marble baths of the old world and called them public works. They took the atmospheric heaters and called them fireplaces. They took the giant iron-domed greenhouses and called them conservatories. They shrunk the scale of human possibility until we were small enough to fit into their ledger books. This is the intellectual provocation. We are living in a giant's house and pretending we built it for our own size. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a demolition project? To install the new debt-based infrastructure, the old free energy infrastructure had to be physically removed. This explains the inexplicable Great Fires that leveled the downtown districts of nearly every major Western city between 1840 and 1920. These were not accidents of dry timber and high winds. They were the burning of the evidence. Notice how the reconstruction always involved the installation of telegraph wires, gas pipes, and electrical meters. The fire was the catalyst for the subscription model of existence. The original money was non-extractive. It was a byproduct of being in harmony with the Earth's ionosphere. The new money was a parasite. To make the parasite the master, the host's previous strength had to be forgotten. The fires were the ritual of forgetting. Ask yourself, why does the history of every major city begin with a catastrophic flame? The institutional gatekeeping extends to the very soil beneath our feet. The mud flood was not just a geological event, it was a tactical layering. By raising the street levels of the world by 10 to 15 feet, the controllers buried the most sophisticated parts of the Tartarian energy receptors. The basements of our older buildings are actually the ground floors of a submerged era. In these buried levels, you find the heavy masonry, the strange copper conduits, and the arched passages that once hummed with power. We are told these were servant quarters or storage. Not this, not that, something else. They were the engine rooms. By burying them, the new authorities ensured that the source of the power remained out of sight and out of mind. We walk on the roof of a lost world, oblivious to the fact that the floor we stand on is a lid. The technical language of the 19th century is riddled with anomalies that academia refuses to address. Why did the Great Eastern, a ship launched in 1858, possess a scale and complexity that dwarfed anything built for decades after? Why was the transatlantic cable successfully laid using technology that, by all rights, should have been in its infancy? The answer is that the technology wasn't new, it was recovered. The Tartarian people had already mapped the oceans. They had already laid the lines. The pioneers of the mid-1800s were simply reactivating a dormant system. The world's original money was a global network of communication and power that required no central authority. The struggle of the 1800s was the struggle to centralize that network, to put a gate on the road, to put a switch on the light, to put a price on the air. Observe the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. The term Gothic was originally a slur meant to imply something barbaric, but the architecture is anything but barbaric. It is a masterpiece of load distribution and acoustic levitation. The massive pipe organs were not musical instruments in the sense we understand today. They were frequency generators. When the Tartarian people gathered in these spaces, they weren't worshipping a distant deity. They were tuning their biological systems to the resonant frequency of the building. The stained glass was not just art. It was a filter for specific light spectra. The money of this era was health, clarity, and connection. When the cathedrals were co-opted by the institutional religions of the Reset, the organs were silenced or limited to hymns, and the knowledge of the frequency was hoarded by the elite. The banks of the New World were built to look like temples, but they were hollowed out. They kept the stone, but they killed the vibration. The staccato rhythm of the modern workday is a direct imposition of the new economy. In the Tartarian world, productivity was not tied to the artificial light of a bulb. It was tied to the natural cycles of the planet. By destroying the world's original money, the controllers destroyed the human relationship with the sun and the moon. They gave us the weekend, a brief reprieve from the grind, as a substitute for the rhythmic life of the previous age. The somber reality is that we are exhausted, not because we work too hard, but because we are working against the grain of the Earth's natural energy. We are like batteries being charged with the wrong voltage. The institutional erasure has made us believe that burnout is a personal failing rather than a systemic consequence of living in a hijacked world. Ask yourself, why is the modern world so tired? The pattern of the world's fairs continues to reveal the blueprint of the theft. In 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair featured a palace of electricity that was larger than any building seen before or since. It was a temporary structure, we are told, yet it was filled with technologies that seemed to defy the limits of the time. Wireless transmission, high-frequency healing, and cold light. After the fair, these technologies vanished. They were classified, they were suppressed, they were replaced by the clunky, dangerous, and expensive systems of the General Electric era. The Tartarian people's legacy was dismantled and sold back to us as progress. The original money was the knowledge of how to live without a bill. The destruction of that money was the birth of the consumer. We are coming to the end of the narrative arc that began in the smoke of the 19th century. The unresolved philosophical open loop is growing louder as the modern financial system trembles under the weight of its own emptiness. The ruins of the Tartarian world are starting to reappear, not just in the dirt, but in the collective consciousness. People are starting to ask why the old buildings feel better than the new ones. They are starting to ask why the history. Books are so vague about the years 1840 to 1890. They are starting to see the copper domes for what they really are. The investigation is not about returning to the past. It is about reclaiming the potential that was stolen. If the world's original money was once destroyed, can it be reminted? Can we find the frequency again? The answer is not in the vaults. It is in the air. It is in the stone. It is in you. Ask yourself, what if the reset is happening again, but this time we are the ones who remember? The maps of the 1850s are not mere cartography. They are the blueprints of a crime scene. If you look at the official territorial shifts of the Russian Empire during this period, you will see a massive, silent swallowing of land. We are told the eastward expansion was a civilizing mission into the rugged wilderness of the steppe. Not this, not that, something else. It was the systematic annexation of the Tartarian heartland. The institutional gatekeepers have rebranded this as the unification of Russia, but the architectural remnants tell a different story. In cities like Omsk and Tomsk, you find the same Greco-Roman pillars, the same subterranean window wells, and the same massive load distribution found in the old world of the West. Ask yourself, how did a nomadic population, as the history books describe them, build the foundations of a neoclassical empire before the conquerors even arrived? The original money of the Tartarian people, their communal resonant energy grid, was the prize of this conquest. By seizing the star forts of the Ural Mountains, the rising Romanovs didn't just expand a border, they hijacked a power plant. The language of the 19th century is haunted by the word restoration. Every major landmark in Europe, we are told, underwent a massive restoration between 1850 and 1880. But look at the before and after sketches. The restoration almost always involved the removal of intricate metal antennae, the capping of copper domes with lead, and the stripping of strange crystalline ornaments from the gables. This was not repair. It was a lobotomy. The Tartarian people used these buildings as receivers for atmospheric electricity, a currency of the air that funded their entire social structure. By restoring these buildings, the new authorities were effectively pulling the plugs. They left the beautiful stone shells, the aesthetic of the old world, while gutting the functional core. This is the ultimate institutional erasure. To leave the monument standing, but to hide its true purpose in plain sight. They turned the generators into museums and told us the silence was reverence. What if the Great Famine of the mid-19th century was not a failure of the soil, but a failure of the frequency? The Tartarian mastery of resonance extended to agriculture. There are accounts of electroculture used in the 1800s. strange copper wires and magnets placed in the fields that resulted in massive, oversized harvests. Not magic, not myth, something else. It was a technical application of the world's original money. When the global grid was disrupted during the reset, the fields went silent. The earth stopped vibrating at the frequency of abundance. The famines that followed provided the perfect cover for the displacement of populations. The people who knew how to sing to the soil were starved out or forced into the cities to become cogs in the coal-fired machine. The institutional gatekeeping blames a fungus or a drought. I blame the disconnection of the battery. Consider the founding of the Australian colonies. We are told of a harsh, empty land where convicts were sent to suffer. Yet, in the middle of this supposed wilderness, cities like Melbourne and Sydney sprang up in less than 20 years with a grandeur that rivaled London. Ask yourself, how did a colony of prisoners and guards, struggling with basic survival, quarry millions of tons of stone necessary for the Royal Exhibition Building? How did they master the load distribution for domes that should have required centuries of architectural evolution? The somber reality is that they didn't. They found it. Australia was not a new discovery. It was a Tartarian outpost that had been cleared during the previous century's reset. The convicts were not there to build a new world. They were there to act as a clean-up crew for the old one. The history of the outback is a narrative of erasure, designed to hide the fact that the southern hemisphere was once as electrified as the northern. The technical language of masonry hides the true nature of the materials. We are taught that the great buildings of the 1800s were made of simple stone and mortar. But chemical analysis of these stones often reveals they are geopolymeric, a form of ancient high-tech concrete that acts as a semiconductor. The Tartarian people weren't just building, they were printing circuits on a monumental scale. The original money was literally baked into the walls. This is why the institutional gatekeepers are so obsessed with urban renewal. They have to tear down these geopolymeric structures because they still function. Even without the copper spires, the stones themselves still hold a charge. They still resonate with a memory of a time when the human spirit was not metered. Every time a historic building is demolished, a piece of the original battery is destroyed. Not for safety, not for progress, for the preservation of the illusion. Observe the phenomenon of the sarcophages that flooded the world in the late 1800s. In every major city, massive palatial buildings were dedicated to housing thousands of parentless children. This is the most somber chapter of the erasure. If you want to kill a civilization, you must kill its memory. You must separate the children from the parents who remember the frequency. These children were raised in the very buildings that were once Tartarian energy hubs, but they were taught they were charity cases. They were given new names, new histories, and a new value based on their labour. They were the first generation of the debt-based world. The staccato rhythm of the industrial loom became their heartbeat. They were the human capital that replaced the atmospheric currency. Ask yourself, what happened to the adults of the 1850s? Where did the people who understood the world's original money go? They were liquidated, and their children were reprogrammed to be the consumers of their own stolen inheritance. The pattern of institutional gatekeeping is most visible in the way we treat ancient ruins. Why are the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Angkor Wat treated as mysteries instead of precedents? By labeling the Tartarian-style technology as ancient history, the controllers push it into a safe, irrelevant past. They want you to think that those people are gone and their magic is lost. But the technology is not ancient. It was operational as recently as 150 years ago. The world's original money was not lost over millennia. It was stolen over decades. The ruins are not evidence of a slow decline, but of a sudden, violent interruption. The intellectual provocation here is that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are the survivors of a catastrophic regression, living in the shadow of a sophistication we are no longer allowed to acknowledge. What if the gold rush of 1849 was actually a copper and mercury rush? History focuses on the gold to distract us from the fact that the early miners were actually scavenging for the conductive materials left behind in the ruins of the western Tartarian outposts. Mercury was essential for the high-frequency energy systems of the old world. If you look at the records of early mining towns, the volume of mercury being processed is staggering. It wasn't for refining gold, it was the gold. It was the fuel of the original money. By the time the pioneers were done, the ruins had been stripped of their functional components, and the narrative was shifted to a simple story of greed and grit. The erasure trope is a masterclass in redirection. They give you a nugget of gold so you won't look at the copper wire. The unresolved philosophical open loop of our age is the question of sustainability. We are told that we are running out of resources, that we must pay more for less, and that we must sacrifice our comfort to save the planet. This is a cruel joke in the face of the Tartarian legacy. The original money was sustainable by definition. It was the extraction of the infinite. By destroying that system, the controllers created the very scarcity they now use to justify their power. We are being sold the solution to a problem that they manufactured. The somber truth is that the energy crisis is a management tool. As long as you believe energy is finite, you will believe your freedom is finite. But the stones of the star forts still hum. The atmospheric charge is still there, waiting for a receiver. As the investigation deepens, the sense of being watched by the architecture grows. The buildings are not passive. They are the silent witnesses to the year the world's original money was destroyed. They are the evidence that a different way of being is possible. The institutional gatekeeping is failing as the digital age allows us to compare the patterns across the globe. We see the same domes in Iowa and Iran. We see the same star forts in Japan and Portugal. We see the same lie being told in every language. The investigative essayist does not seek to fix the past, but to awaken the present. Ask yourself, what if the money in your pocket is the only thing keeping you from the power in the air? What if the year of destruction was just the beginning of a cycle that is now coming to a close? The investigation is not over. It is merely reaching its most dangerous phase. The census data from the mid-19th century contains a chilling statistical silence. Between 1850 and 1880, the population of the Russian interior, the American West, and the Australian coast underwent a demographic replacement so total it can only be described as a planetary reboot. The institutional gatekeepers call it migration. I call it the liquidation of the legacy. Ask yourself, where did the master builders go? The ones who understood the load distribution of a cathedral that doubles as a power plant do not simply stop building. They are stopped. This was the year the Tartarian people, the custodians of the world's original money, were erased from the legal definitions of humanity. They were reclassified as insurgents, nomads, or indigenous to justify the seizure of their infrastructure. The somber reality is that the industrial age was built on the bones of a high-frequency civilization that had already achieved what we are still struggling to simulate with fossil fuels. Observe the great fires of the 1870s through a forensic lens. In every instance, from Chicago to Constantinople, the fire departments of the era reported an inability to extinguish the flames, not because of a lack of water, but because the buildings themselves seemed to be combusting from within. Not wood, not hay, something else. When you strip a Tartarian capacitor of its grounding rods, the spires and the mercury-filled phene shales, the atmospheric charge has nowhere to go. It builds until the very stone reaches a thermal limit. The fires were not accidents. They were the result of the deliberate sabotage of the energy grid. By removing the ornamental copper from the rooftops, the new authorities turned the cities into tinderboxes. This was the year the original money, the free radiance of the ether, was turned into a weapon of mass destruction. To justify the transition to coal and oil, they had to prove that the old way was dangerous. The architecture of the new world is a language of concealment. Look at the massive, windowless brick facades of the early electrical substations in New York and London. They were built with the same neoclassical proportions as the temples of old, but they were sealed shut. Why? Because inside they weren't generating power, they were converting it. They were taking the wireless, longitudinal waves of the Tartarian grid and forcing them into transverse metered cables. The institutional erasure required the physical containment of the source. The original money was a broad spectrum gift that powered the mind as much as the machine. The new money was a narrow band frequency that induced lethargy and compliance. We are told the war of the currents was a battle between Edison and Tesla. What if it was actually a clean-up operation to ensure that no matter who won, the energy would be tied to a bill? Consider the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, one of the few survivors of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. It is a haunting, melancholic structure, built on a scale that suggests it was intended for beings larger and more refined than ourselves. History claims it was built in a few months out of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fibre. This is an institutional lie. Go there today. Touch the columns, feel the resonance of the aggregate. It is geopolymeric stone, engineered for a lifespan of millennia. Why would they build a temporary structure with such permanent materials? Because it wasn't temporary. It was a pre-existing Tartarian node that they couldn't afford to destroy yet. They re-skinned it, called it an exhibit, and then spent the next century trying to explain why they can't build anything like it today. The erasure trope is most effective when it turns a masterpiece into a temporary attraction. The technical language of the reset is hidden in the way we talk about liquidity and flow. In the Tartarian era, these words referred to the literal movement of ionized water through the canal systems of the star forts. Water was the dielectric medium of the world's original money. By 1890, the canals were being filled with the rubble of the old world. The flow was moved from the canals to the ledger books. The liquidity was moved from the fountains to the banks. This was the year they turned a physical reality into a financial abstraction. The somber truth is that as long as our wealth exists only on paper or in digital bits, it can be erased by the same hand that wrote it. The Tartarian people were free because their wealth was as tangible as the pressure in a pipe and as ubiquitous as the static in the air. Ask yourself why the Great Depression followed so closely after the final dismantling of the wireless energy towers. Once the population was fully dependent on the metered grid, the controllers had the ultimate on-off switch for civilization. By restricting the flow of the new money, they could simulate poverty in a world of physical abundance. This is the intellectual provocation. Poverty is a technical glitch manufactured by the gatekeepers. In the Tartarian world, poverty was a physical impossibility because the energy required for heat, light, and transport was a baseline right of existence. The year they destroyed the original money was the year they made survival a competitive sport. Not a natural state, not a necessity, a tool of management. The staccato rhythm of the modern city, the flashing lights, the humming wires, the constant roar of combustion, is a jarring contrast to the silent power of the old world. The Tartarian buildings didn't hum, they vibrated. They didn't glow with the flickering orange of a filament. They radiated with the steady blue of the luminiferous ether. This cold light is visible in the earliest long-exposure photographs of the 1850s, where the streets of Paris and St. Petersburg appear to be illuminated by an invisible sun. The institutional erasure has dismissed these as photographic artifacts. Not this, not that, something else. They are the visual evidence of the atmospheric currency. When you look at those photos, you are looking at a world that didn't need a power plant because the world was the power plant. What if the world wars were not about borders, but about the final scrapping of the Tartarian metal? Every brass railing, every copper pipe, and every iron gate donated to the war effort was a piece of the old grid being sent to the furnace. They told us it was for the front. I tell you, it was for the erasure. By melting down the components of the old money, they ensured that the technology could never be reconstructed. They turned the capacitors into cannonballs and the resonators into rifles. The somber irony is that we use the very materials that once gave us free energy to kill the people who remembered how to use them. This was the ultimate institutional gatekeeping, the transformation of a global inheritance into a global graveyard. The pattern of the reset is now entering its digital phase. The original money of the air is being replaced by the programmable money of the screen. The erasure is no longer about burning buildings, it is about deleting data. But the load distribution of the truth is too heavy for their digital silos. The stones are starting to leak their secrets. As the modern infrastructure fails, as the metered world becomes too expensive to maintain, the ruins of the Tartarian age are becoming more than just curiosities. They are becoming blueprints again. The investigation is shifting from a somber eulogy to a provocative recovery mission. We are not just looking at the past, we are looking at a dormant future. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this: if the Tartarian people were destroyed because they made the world too free, what will happen to us when we rediscover their methods? The institutional gatekeepers are still there, but their walls are cracking. The year the world's original money was destroyed was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long, dark sleep, and the world is starting to wake up. Ask yourself, if the air is full of power and the stone is full of memory, why are you still working for paper? The investigation continues, not in the silence of the archives, but in the resonance of the streets. The silence of the Great Step is not the silence of a void, but the silence of a tomb. If you look at the topographical surveys of the late 19th century, you will notice a strange phenomenon: the disappearance of over 400 registered walled towns between the years 1850 and 1890. They were not lost to time, not this, not that, something else. They were victims of the institutional erasure. These were the Tartarian administrative nodes, the local banks of the atmospheric grid. Each one was anchored by a central tower, a lighthouse of the land that broadcast the original money, the resonant harmonic, to the surrounding fields. When the Russian and Qing empires partitioned the territory, their first order of business was the decommissioning of these towers. We are told the Trans-Siberian Railway was an engineering miracle. Ask yourself, why does its path align so perfectly with the ancient ley lines of the star forts? It wasn't a new trail, it was a recovery line designed to strip the copper and the mercury from the silent cities of the interior and haul them back to the new central banks of Europe. The language of obsolescence is a weapon. In the mid-1800s, the world was filled with gaslighting systems that required no external fuel source. They were known as self-generating lamps, using the pressure differential of the atmospheric ether. History calls them a myth or a misunderstanding of early chemical reactions. But look at the street lamps of London and Paris from 1860. They are heavy, ornate, and lack the pipes required for modern gas delivery. They were stand-alone receivers. This was the year the world's original money, the localized energy of the home, was replaced by the centralized grid. The institutional gatekeepers forced the obsolescence of the self-generating lamp to ensure that every light in every house could be turned off by a single switch in a government office. The somber truth is that progress is often just a synonym for dependency. By trading a receiver for a wire, we traded our sovereignty for a bill. Consider the Great Mud Flood as a forensic layer of the reset. We are taught that the raised streets of Seattle, Chicago, and Atlanta were necessary to install sewers. But look at the masonry of the buried floors. It is more intricate, more durable, and more technologically advanced than the modern brickwork built on top of it. Why bury the best part of the building? Because the bottom floor of a Tartarian structure was the grounding plate of the energy system. It was filled with saltwater batteries and magnetic coils. By burying these levels in 10 feet of silt and debris, the architects of the New World physically disconnected the population from the source. They literally grounded the rebellion. This was the year the original money was buried alive. We now walk on the ceiling of a laboratory we are no longer allowed to enter. The staccato rhythm of our footsteps on the sidewalk is a hollow sound, echoing over the hidden chambers of our own potential. What if the gold standard was a psychological operation designed to hide the mercury standard? In the old world, mercury was the liquid silver that allowed for the superconductivity of the domes. It was the original money because it was the medium through which the ether was converted into usable power. Look at the red mercury myths that still haunt the intelligence communities. They are the garbled echoes of a lost technology. When the Tartarian people were liquidated, the first thing the victors did was seize the mercury. They replaced the functional value of the liquid metal with the symbolic value of the solid gold. They told us that wealth was something you store in a vault rather than something you use to light your city. The institutional erasure turned a technology into a commodity, and in doing so, they turned us into miners instead of masters. The architecture of the Star Fort is the ultimate intellectual provocation. Official history calls them Tres Italiane fortifications, designed to deflect cannon fire. But look at them from the air. They are fractals. They are mandalas. They are the geometry of the snowflake and the crystal. Cannonballs do not care about sacred geometry. These were not military outposts. They were resonant basins. They were designed to amplify the Earth's natural frequency, creating a localized field of original money that made the inhabitants healthier, more alert, and more resistant to psychological manipulation. This is why they had to be destroyed, not because they were a threat to an army, but because they were a threat to an ideology. A person living in a star fort cannot be easily enslaved by the staccato rhythm of debt. The erasure trope required that we see these magnificent resonators as primitive defences, so that we would not ask why we no longer build them. Observe the great exhibitions through the lens of a global liquidation sale. The 1851 Crystal Palace was not a greenhouse. It was a massive, glass-enclosed capacitor, capable of holding a static charge that could be felt for miles. It was a demonstration of Tartarian atmospheric mastery, rebranded as a British triumph. After the fair, it was moved, and then, inevitably, it burned down. The fires of the 19th century were the erasers of the architects. They allowed the new masters to claim the inventions of the old world as their own, while destroying the physical evidence that these inventions were part of a larger, unified system. The original money was fragmented into patents, and the global heritage was sold back to us in pieces. The somber reality is that we are paying for the privilege of using a stolen engine. The staccato sentences of the telegraph were the first digital cage. Before the telegraph, information moved at the speed of the horse, but it also moved through the resonance of the Tartarian network, a form of collective intuition that has been scrubbed from the record. The telegraph didn't just speed up communication, it restricted it. It forced human thought into the binary of dots and dashes. It was the linguistic equivalent of moving from the broad spectrum original money to the narrow band currency. The institutional gatekeepers tell us this was the birth of the information age. I tell you it was the death of the intuitive age. We are now connected by 1 billion wires, but we have never been more isolated from the frequency of the truth. The pattern of the reset is visible in the very stones of our universities. Ask yourself, why is classical architecture the standard for the halls of higher learning? It is a subtle form of gaslighting. They want us to study the classics inside the very buildings they stole, while teaching us that the people who built them were primitive. It is a masterclass in institutional gatekeeping. By placing the lie inside the truth, they make the truth invisible. The load distribution of the academic narrative is designed to collapse if you pull on a single thread. If the Tartarian people built the universities, then everything taught inside them about the history of Western civilization is a fabrication. This is the somber, provocative heart of the investigation. We are being educated by the thieves of our own history. What if the original money was never actually destroyed, but merely retuned? The atmospheric energy is still there. The ley lines still hum. The star forts still resonate, even under the mud. The year the world's original money was destroyed was actually the year it was hidden behind a paywall. The destruction was a legal and psychological maneuver, not a physical one. The frequency was shifted from the public air to the private wire. The unresolved philosophical open loop is the realization that the power has never left us. It is waiting for us to stop looking at the meter and start looking at the dome. It is waiting for us to remember that value is not something you earn, but something you inhabit. The investigation is now moving toward the final harvest. We have seen the patterns of the fires, the floods, and the orphans. We have seen the erasure of the maps and the renaming of the giants. We have felt the somber weight of the stolen years. But the investigative essayist does not end with a lament. We end with a provocation. If the original money was based on resonance, then the only way to reclaim it is to resonate, to refuse the staccato rhythm of the reset and return to the flow of the ether. The year they destroyed the world's original money was the year they lost the ability to control the future, because once the secret is out, the meter starts to run backward. Ask yourself, if the world is a battery, who is the one holding the switch? The investigation continues.